So when you're studying physics, you're going to need to do a little bit of trigonometry along with a little bit of algebra. And in this video, I'm going to give you the basic trigonometry that you're going to need when it comes to you starting to learn physics. Now, there are entire courses taught about trig, but what I'm going to show you in this video are the trig functions that you need to know for when you start to learn physics. And if I'm going to be honest with you, it's really not that much. In reality, there's only two things that you need to know in trigonometry for when you start to learn physics. I mean, of course, knowing more trig is always better, but if you got these basic things down, then I think you're going to be fine. So the trig that we're going to be dealing with is trigonometry dealing with a right triangle. So it means it has two sides and then some hypotenuse, which is this side over here. That's the longest side of the triangle. And along with that, the two principles that you need to make sure you know are Pythagorean Theorem, which is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And you also need to make sure you understand SOH CAH TOA. So you may or may not have a good understanding of those two, or maybe it's a little fuzzy. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to assume you know some trig and you're familiar with this, but you're a little hazy on the memory. So I'm not going to go super in depth on it, but I am going to hopefully jog your memory. So let's start off with Pythagorean Theorem, which we know is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So we'll have some sort of triangle that's a right triangle, and it's got a 90-degree angle. Now it has two sides. We'll call this side over here A. We'll call this side down here B. And the hypotenuse we're going to call C. Now the beauty of the Pythagorean theorem is that if you know two lengths on this triangle, then you know the third length as well. So let's say we're trying to find the length of the hypotenuse, which is C. Well, we'll take a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And then we got to get rid of this squared over here. So what we do is you square root both sides of the equation. So it turns into a squared plus b squared, square root all of that, equals c. Now, whenever you're doing these functions, you're probably going to be relying on your calculator, and that's perfectly fine. I just want to make sure that you plug your numbers in the calculator correctly. Now, you notice that my square root goes over this entire function. I've seen a lot of times whenever a student is typing this in their calculator and they accidentally type a squared under the square root plus b squared equals c, and that's wrong. That's not going to work in the calculator. That's not going to give you the right result. You have to make sure that everything is under the square root when you're dealing with Pythagorean theorem like this. Now, another way to solve for maybe A or B, let's solve for A. We'll have a squared plus b squared equals c squared, and we're just going to do a little bit of algebra to rearrange this equation to solve for A. So what we'll do is we'll subtract b squared from both sides. Cancels out b squared over here, and that gives us a squared equals c squared minus b squared. Then we'll need to square root both sides of this, and to find the length of side A, it would be a equals the square root of c squared minus b squared. Once again, the square root covers everything. And you could do the same process as that to solve for b as well. So you're going to run into some problems when you're learning physics where you're going to need to use Pythagorean theorem. So there's a quick review showing you how to do that. But now let's go into SOH CAH TOA. SOH CAH TOA. Now SOH CAH TOA is just a way to memorize the sine, cosine, and tangent functions. Once again, we're dealing with right triangles. So it's got some sort of right angle and then some other angle. We're going to call this angle theta. Now, if we're looking at this particular triangle, we got three sides that are around this angle theta right here. We got this part at the bottom, which is adjacent to the angle. And we got this side of the triangle over here, which is opposite to the angle, and then we got the hypotenuse of the triangle. Now, like I said earlier, SOH CAH TOA is just a way to memorize the sine, cosine, and tangent functions. So what SO means, SOH, it means sine of the angle is equal to the opposite of the angle divided by the hypotenuse. So for you to plug into your calculator sine, then whatever degree that angle is, it's going to be equal to the opposite side length of the triangle divided by the hypotenuse length of the triangle. Now, what if you don't know the angle, but you want to find out the angle? Well, that means you're going to have to rearrange the equation. So you're going to have to move the sine to the other side of the equation, and that's going to look like the angle is equal to sine inverse multiplied by the opposite over the hypotenuse. And you have that sine inverse, sine to the -1 on your calculator. So that's the equation you would use if you wanted to find the angle of that triangle, and you knew the length of the opposite side of the triangle and you knew the length of the hypotenuse of the triangle. Now, what if you wanted to find the length of the opposite side of the triangle, which is something you might actually have to do in physics? Well, you would just do a little bit of algebra again, and you would multiply the hypotenuse on both sides. So it'd be the hypotenuse multiplied by sine theta is equal to the opposite length. And you could do a little more algebra if you wanted to find the length of the hypotenuse of the triangle, and you would find that the opposite length of the triangle divided by sine of the angle is equal to the length of the hypotenuse. So we're just doing algebra manipulation to get different equations. One way to find the angle, one way to find the opposite length of the triangle, and another way to find the hypotenuse of the triangle. So that's for sine, but what about cosine? So cosine is the adjacent and the hypotenuse. So cosine of the angle is equal to adjacent divided by hypotenuse. And once again, if we wanted to solve for the angle of the triangle using cosine, and we might use cosine because we know the adjacent length and the hypotenuse length, but we don't know the opposite length. Anyways, you would solve for the angle by taking the angle, and it's equal to cosine inverse adjacent over hypotenuse. And I could do all the same algebra manipulation that I did for sine on cosine to find the adjacent or the hypotenuse. Now, lastly, let's talk about tangent. And tangent's pretty much the same story as the other two. And you can see tangent, TOA, it involves the opposite and the adjacent, but it doesn't involve the hypotenuse. So tan theta is equal to the opposite divided by the hypotenuse. And once again, I could solve for just the angle by saying tan inverse multiplied by the opposite over the hypotenuse. And there you have it, guys. That's basically all the trig you need to know whenever you are starting to learn physics. Now, remember, I made that video with the assumption that you had some understanding of trig already, and I just wanted to highlight the parts that you're going to need to use in physics. Now, I got one more video that I want to show you before you start diving into all the different physics that you're going to be learning. And I'm going to be showing you a problem-solving trick that's going to help you, if not solve a problem, get really close to solving a problem and get moving in the right direction. So stick around and watch that.